Before we get started with Genesis 2, Adam and Eve, I'd like to ask you personally, is it better to have something than to have nothing? And I ask this question because a lot of people get really caught up in this day and age about just the pain of the world and the suffering that exists behind it and the plague that humanity is against the world. And a lot of people feel this on an individual level. They can feel like this on a community level. They can feel it like this on a global level. But we haven't actually seen that yet. Right now, we're still, we just set the context for the backdrop of, just the planet as it is, and the sun and the stars down to the water and the sea creatures and the air creatures and so on and so forth. So, and what we've seen so far is that it's all good. So how could something that was all created be good eventually turn into something like that? And how do we avoid falling into some of those pitfalls? So as we start this narrative for this next chapter, we start seeing that that God is creating this man out of nothing. It's not even nothing; it's from the dust of the earth. So it's literally of the stuff of the earth that was created. He's creating man, and he says something unique, or at least here in the text, it says something unique, which is that he breathed life into his nostrils, and that's really interesting, using the word breath in particular, not necessarily a spirit or an energy, but a breath. And what I also find interesting is that as he's creating vegetation around this man he's calling Adam, there's this tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and there's this tree of life. And at some point he says, you can't eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil because you will surely die, which we'll talk about, the context of that in a second. But he doesn't say not to eat from the tree of life, and that is clearly mentioned here in this text. So the next point here on performance, for kind of taking lessons from Genesis 2 on upping your personal peak performance, is you want to be giving life to yourself. You want to be consuming things that give you life. Breath is one of these things, and literally foods that literally give you life. And, it's very easy to be the case that, people are just not breathing enough. They're not running. They don't have enough aerobics. They're not doing any breathing exercises. They're forgetting to breathe. They're breathing irregularly. It's an important part of our human biology. You could look at the cellular metabolism equation. It's literally sugars plus, or glucose plus oxygen equals, CO2 plus, H2O plus energy. It's creating energy to actually go through that process. So it's important that, as living beings, you have to give yourself energy, whether it's eating from things that actually create the energy. It's very easy to eat things these days that sort of break you down, that create almost inflammatory type of effects, and kind of expedite your death, so to speak. So really important lesson on performance here is to give life to yourself. And what I would also say is to go give life to things. What we see here is that Adam is, Adam's really working with God. He is, God is saying, hey, look at all these animals here. What are these supposed to be called? And instead of God naming them, Adam actually went forth and named them and said, whatever you call this animal, that's what it's going to be. And that's really interesting to me, because you're almost taking on, the labors that God has been doing so far, and man is now starting to do it himself. And that's kind of cool, because there's no example for how man should behave. I mean, there's no example for how animals should behave. They're just being. But knowing that man was created in God's image, man starts doing things that are like God, which, if you remember from the last chapter, he's just labeling things. He's calling things into existence and saying that it's good. And, kind of a short answer to what we started the conversation here today with is that, yes, it is better to have things than to have nothing, because the word better really implies utility. It implies some added utility to just the presence of things, because if there's no utility, then there's chaos. If there's chaos, there's nothing, and then there's no meaning behind something, because meaning itself is structure around an experience of existence itself. So generally speaking, we see that Adam is actually labeling things, and he's giving a role to them, and he's working at the same time. And these are all good things, and they're all good things because God said it was good, and we have to start somewhere, right? And I think that just starting from somewhere where there's some structure and some hierarchy behind it, it really gives, some utility to something where we could start building a foundation somewhere. So not a bad foundation to say, hey, I'm going to do as God does here and start giving life to things. So, but what I'm interested in here is this first command that God gives to Adam, which says, "You are free to eat from any tree in the garden, but you must not eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. For when you eat from it, you will certainly die." Now, we could see in the next chapter, this starts to get twisted around a little bit, but, I started looking back at the etymology of the word die, and it's, we could say that it's literally to die, like we know what dying means, is to cease living. But we could play around with those words a little bit and say, okay, well, that's, there's many ways to cease living, so to speak. Maybe back in this day at the beginning of humanity, and we will see in future chapters, people just lived for a very long time, and then eventually they died, they stopped living. But in this initial chapter, we just had a chapter where you had whole aspects of the planet Earth being done in a day. How could we be so confident that we haven't fully departed from that type of poetry by saying that someone is going to certainly die? And we see later on that the serpent says, no, you're not going to go die. But maybe there's something that does die. Maybe someone's not truly living. And, a lot of people today, they're not truly living. And I think a lot of that comes from this, this sense of knowledge of good and evil, of what is good and what is evil, which we haven't even given labels to yet, but here it is. So to the next point here, speaking on communication, I think that when words start getting twisted around, then you start seeing opportunities for this chaos to come back. It's the same reason why people might think nothing is better than something, because there's a lot of suffering that comes with something in the first place. And with all that suffering being created, it might feel actually good for one reason or another to go back to nothing, to cease being, which is kind of it's actually an extremely scary place to be in. But that's one of those places where chaos sneaks back in, where it feels good to go do something. So I want to be very mindful here that, as we're building our foundation, and as further and further we get from the foundation, the easier and easier it is to start twisting some of the words in subtle ways. And this really is the first twist on this word of certainly dying. And we see that, Adam and Eve, that they were both naked and they felt no shame. There's really nothing to feel with that. There's no social humiliation that comes with this. There's no loss because, what are clothes even? What is shame even? They don't have it because they don't have that knowledge of good and evil. So this first statement here that, when you eat from it, you will certainly die, the words start getting a little fuzzy. So to that, I would give the lesson of, when you're communicating, it's really important that you speak impeccably, that you speak very precisely about what you intend to say. And we see great examples of this is that that man is labeling things just as God has, and we can see that God is doing good things. Man is doing things like God. As a result of that transitive property, man is doing good things. When we start twisting some of the words, it starts to get fuzzy. We really, really want to be very clear from the foundational aspect, because if it's fuzzy in the foundation, it's going to be 100 times more fuzzy when things get built out. So we want to be absolutely clear. And finally, on leadership, I've been saying this whole time, is that you want to do things as God does, and even as God instructs. He says that that man should leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and then they become one in flesh. There's something special about the male-female dichotomy, and this story about a piece of this man's flesh, being taken from him and put into this woman, and how they unite back with each other to come flesh back in flesh again. And I know that there's sometimes utility in separation. When you separate something, it creates some excitement. If that wasn't the case, then the next meal you have, just throw it all in a blender and try drinking it and see what happens. It's actually, there's an excitement when you have a contrast between, a meat and a cheese and a vegetable and and a salad, like whatever that is, like there's an energy that gets created with a separation. I don't really know how to articulate it that well, but when you pull something apart and that it has this desire to come back together, this magnetic energy to come back together, it, in a weird way, kind of creates energy, which is very odd. And I think that's the type of energy that's behind some of that creationary force. So go as a leader, go create as God does. Go do things that he has done. Going to go and labeling the animals of the planet, creating hierarchies behind them, creating the relationships behind them, allowing the people that he leads himself to give them names. Go take that role and go give names, and to go through things as God instructed here. And for a man and a woman to unite back together in flesh, there's something very foundational, the fact that it's in one of these first chapters. Like, this, I don't know how long ago this text was written, but certainly not so long ago that it's anywhere close to the actual beginning of time. It's a retelling of a story. So to sum up, on the beginning story of Adam and Eve, really the creation part where God is creating man. Give life to things, including yourself, especially yourself. Speak impeccably. Be very mindful not to accidentally get your words twisted around. Otherwise, it creates problems later on. And go and create as God does. Go and create. And you could look back at the Bible and you could look back at other examples, very foundational. If not look at the Bible, look at other foundational texts. And do as these people are doing that happen to live great lives and live long enough to tell the tale and write a text that lasted as long as today. So those are the 3 lessons for today.